You don't think that would open a Pandora's box?
The box is already open, Jonathan. They just don't have control of the Senate as well as control of the White House. You know, Democrats hide behind so many traditions, not laws, but traditions.
Fresh off her recent viral confrontation with Marjorie Taylor Greene, Democratic superstar Jasmine Crockett joined AOC and others in calling for major reforms to the United States Supreme Court and challenging other Democrats who've been too timid to use the power they have on this issue and others. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bell before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to look at in this video. All of them include Jasmine Crockett, a freshman Democratic congresswoman from Texas, one of my favorites, somebody I hope to interview in the near future, fingers crossed. And it also features necessary reforms to the United States Supreme Court, which, as you know, has been captured by a bad faith right-wing supermajority. In this first clip, Jasmine Crockett talks about legislation that she and other House Democrats are trying to get through, which would bring at least some of these necessary reforms about.
Incident. You know, I had my little drama that happened in oversight. Unfortunately, what wasn't covered was that the court reform task force was rolled out the exact same week. And in that task force, we've got three major things that we're looking at. We're looking at, number one, term limits. No more than 18 years. We're also looking at expanding the court because we know right now that we literally cannot trust these folk. And the last thing that we're looking at is making sure that there's some actual ethics reform. So we have three bills that we're pushing forward with. We're trying to educate the rest of our colleagues on it, and we're trying to hopefully get some movement in the House, and then, you know, we just pray about the Senate.
Okay, so this gets to something that House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries said this week. He said if the Supreme Court doesn't, quote, get its act under control, Congress should impose an ethics code. But is that going to take a new Congress and a new Congress with a Democratic majority to get those three bills you're talking about through?
Absolutely. I just don't think that we have the courage on the other side. Oddly enough.
She's right. They don't have the courage, but they also don't have the incentive, right? The Republican Party, as we talked about, folks, is factually a bad faith authoritarian party with no limiting principle. And right now, the United States Supreme Court in its current composition is a 6-3 conservative supermajority. Donald Trump appointed 3 conservative Supreme Court justices. The other 3 were appointed by either President George W. Bush or his father, George H.W. Bush, and they reliably deliver results that the Republicans want. So as far as the Republicans are concerned, they have no interest in changing anything on this court, even if in principle they probably like the idea, right? But because this court does what they want, there's just, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And as far as the Republicans are concerned, this court ain't broke. Now, I'm inspired because Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democratic senator from Rhode Island, and Jamie Raskin, one of my favorite Democratic congresspeople in the House, they seem to be, you know, collaborating on this idea that if and when we win back the House and the Senate and the White House, we will look at the Supreme Court and figure out what can be done about this extremely corrupted and contaminated body, to which Sheldon Whitehouse says, yes, we will, brother. Yes, we will. Sheldon Whitehouse is regrettably not the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Dick Durbin, who is much more feckless and timid than Whitehouse, even though he's also a Democrat. He is the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. But I imagine a timeline where we get really lucky in November, get Biden reelected, keep the Senate, and retake the House. And then Sheldon Whitehouse becomes the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Jamie Raskin becomes chair of the House Judiciary Committee, and I would love that. But yeah, Jasmine Crockett's right. You're going to need a Democratic majority in the House and the Senate, and a Democratic president if any of this legislation has a hope of passing. But we're going to talk about as well in this other clip about how Democrats are just, not all Democrats, but again, the likes of Dick Durbin and others who are well-meaning and experienced, but they're institutionalists to a fault, and they're too timid to leverage the power they have. Jasmine Crockett, she doesn't name them, but she calls that sentiment out and says, listen, Republicans leverage power when they have it. We have no reason to believe that they won't do it if they win this upcoming election. So Democrats, when the people give Democrats power, Democrats should actually use the power, even if other Republican politicians don't like it.
Do you think Justice Alito, I've heard some people say that Justice Alito should be impeached. Would that go too far?
No. I don't think it would.
You don't think that would open a Pandora's box?
The box is already open, Jonathan. They just don't have control of the Senate as well as control of the White House. Although the impeachment is just the Senate. But listen, I don't think that we'll have the filibuster if the Republicans get a hold of the Senate again. You know, Democrats hide behind so many traditions, not laws, but traditions, even when we start talking about appointments to the courts. I mean, it's amazing that the president has been able to do what he's done. But guess what? We've got a ton of vacancies in the state of Texas, and we can't get them because of blue slips. Blue slips are a tradition. They are not law. And basically what we see in the South, where a lot of these terrible cases are coming from, is Republican senators say, no, you can't have any appointments in our state. We're going to hold on until a Republican is in. And then they decide to forum shop and send all their crazy cases to the crazy judges in the South and then take it up through the Fifth Circuit. And then we know what happens when it gets to the Supreme Court.
Well,
she's right. She's 100% right. And I'm so glad we're getting increasingly vocal and increasingly numerous Democrats, particularly from this freshman class, calling this mindset out, this idea. This is something that I harp on a lot on this channel. It's something that I harp on in a lot of debates and conversations I have with other content creators on other channels. OK, I had at the time of recording, a recent debate on a panel about Supreme Court reform. And this is my point. Like, I'm not saying that Democrats should change things recklessly or carelessly, but this idea that we can't change things and we shouldn't change things because it just might piss the Republicans off and then the Republicans will react in bad faith the next time they get power, that means we can't ever change anything. By that logic, Democrats just shouldn't run for office, because you could easily make the case that simply by existing in politics, simply by running in races, electoral races, it could potentially trigger Republicans to overreact, right? This idea that, we just can't create the circumstances in which it could piss off a bad faith Republican Party. There are no such circumstances. Simply by existing, we take that risk. So I would argue that when people vote for Democrats, that Democrats should, when necessary, ruthlessly wield power and change things and force change on things which need to be changed. Liberals doing that is what has made this country better over time. Generally, it was liberals forcing power on conservative slave owners to change slavery laws. We fought a civil war over it, and then we forced change. We didn't negotiate. We said, we're right, you're wrong. We're done talking about this. We have the power, you don't. This idea that if we do that, Republicans are going to act in bad faith. They're already acting in bad faith. And as Jasmine Crockett points out, they don't need us to do something first, to do something themselves. If they win, if Republicans win the upcoming election, they will proactively make changes to make leveraging power easier for them. We saw it when Trump was in office. She referenced the blue slip. If you watch this channel regularly, I've talked quite a bit about the blue slip. It's a tradition which enables the senators of their states to effectively veto a presidential judicial nominee. So if I live in North Carolina. So if I'm the senator of North Carolina and a president wants to fill a judicial vacancy in my state, I can give them a blue slip and say, hey, Mr. President, not that particular nominee. You have to find a different one. It's nowhere to be found in the Constitution. It's a gentleman's agreement. It's a tradition. And Republicans broke that tradition in 2017 when Donald Trump became president of the United States and Republicans had the majority in the Senate. They revoked the blue slip for district court judges, meaning if I'm a Democrat in North Carolina and I say, hey, I'm giving you the blue slip, they gave me the finger and just put through Donald Trump's appointees wherever they wanted. And because Democrats wouldn't do it for district judges, not circuit judges, but district judges, that's the reason why Judge Aileen Cannon is presiding over Donald Trump's court case in Florida, because Republican senators have blocked President Biden's nominees using the blue slip veto. If Biden had been successful and appointed those nominees to Florida, it would have been very unlikely that Cannon would have been the one assigned the case, because there would have been more judges it could have potentially gone to. You see what I'm saying? We are living in the consequences of Democrats refusing to leverage the power they had. They had the power to snap their fingers at any time. Dick Durbin, as long as he's in the majority, as long as he's the chairman, has the power to revoke the blue slip tradition. But he hasn't done it because he's too feckless. I'll point out that the majority of Americans believe that the Supreme Court should be checked. The majority of Americans, according to polls, want Congress to investigate political bias in the Supreme Court. And Supreme Court reform provisions, to varying extents, depending on the provision, are wildly popular with the American people. The American people do not want an unchecked rogue Supreme Court of 9 unelected, philosopher kings being able to impose their will on the president, on the Congress, and on the rest of us, but we can't check them. No, thank you. Checks and balances has to go both ways. If you're going to impose your will on Congress and the president, they should have the power to impose their will on you, and the American people should get a say in all of this. You shouldn't be perfectly insulated. Dick Durbin, again, the Senate Judiciary Chairman, a Democrat, and Sheldon Whitehouse, whom we just talked about, they did issue a letter, to whatever extent it's going to be effective, to Chief Justice John Roberts, demanding that Justice Alito recuse himself from these recent court cases about Donald Trump, and particularly pertaining to Donald Trump's attempts to steal the 2020 election, because Justice Alito was busted flying flags at his home, 2 homes actually, his main home and his vacation home, that were sympathetic to the Stop the Steal, Big Lie movement. And so they're saying, listen, we have credible reason to question his impartiality. He should recuse himself, and you should pressure him to recuse himself. And also, you should sit down with us in Congress so we can talk about this. I want to read an excerpt from their letter. In a statement to the New York Times, Justice Alito said the upside-down flag was, quote, placed by Mrs. Alito in response to a neighbor's use of objectionable and personally insulting language on yard signs. Alito also spoke to Fox News about the incident and indicated that the flag was flown upside down, partially in response to his neighbor's display of political signage. Signage, by the way, which was anti-Trump. So what triggered Mrs. Alito was an anti-Trump yard sign. That doesn't do well for the notion that the Alitos are not biased and not biased in favor of Trump. Seems like they are. Justice Alito's comments reflect both his knowledge of the upside-down flag's display and his understanding of the display's political significance. The Code of Conduct, the Supreme Court Code of Conduct, provides that the Supreme Court justices should avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety in all activities, specifying that, quote, a justice should respect and comply with the law and act at all times in a manner that promotes public confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary, end quote. Furthermore, federal law requires the disqualification of a Supreme Court justice in any proceeding in which the justice's impartiality might be reasonably questioned, and the Code of Conduct elaborates that, quote, a justice should disqualify himself or herself in a proceeding where an unbiased and reasonable person who is aware of all relevant circumstances would doubt the justice could fairly discharge his or her duties. And then they go on to say that the Supreme Court imposes even stricter requirements on their employees. People who aren't judges, just merely working for the Supreme Court, are supposed to refrain from political activity relating to elections contested by political parties, that they can't publicly support or oppose a partisan political organization or candidate. They can't hold up yard signs or have yard signs because it would be seen as a reflection that the court is not impartial. Then by that logic, shouldn't the justices behave likewise? But this is what happens when you have a court that gets to police itself. I'll just end on this. The proposition, folks, is untenable. This is not what the Founding Fathers wanted. The Founding Fathers, to the extent you care about what they wanted, and I know conservatives pick and choose, the Founders intended for the Supreme Court to be the weakest and least active of the branches, not co-equal. Yes, important. Yes, significant, but not more powerful or as powerful as Congress or the president. They were supposed to be the weakest of the three. And in exchange for not having to, suffer elections or re-elections or term limits or mandatory retirement ages or anything like that, they were supposed to behave above partisanship. Congress and the president can be as partisan as they like, but the Supreme Court can't be. You basically have to be perfect. And if you can't be perfect, which they're not, of course, then perhaps there should be more checks on the court. That's reasonable. If you're not going to hold up your end, which is, again, you need to be superhumanly cautious and impartial. If you're not going to do that, then you shouldn't get the extra. Basically, if you're not going to hold up the end where you're part of the obligation, you shouldn't get the rewards that go with it. And that's why, among many reasons, I think the Supreme Court needs to be reformed. I'll also point out that in 49 out of 50 states, 49 out of 50, the laboratories of democracy in our country, their high courts are done very differently. Only Rhode Island, ironically, has lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court that looks like ours. All the others, they're either elected, they're subject to mandatory retirement ages, term limits, binding ethics guidelines. Our Supreme Court is cut a much bigger check. They're given much bigger slack, and there's just no need for it. This court needs to be reined in, and I think that it's insane for anyone to take a position otherwise. The only real reason you would is because you think this court, corrupt as it is, gives you results that you like. So I hope Jasmine Crockett's right. I hope Democrats win the upcoming election. I hope they're able to impose their will on the United States Supreme Court and rein it in. So let me know what you think in the comments.